I've come out again to Battle Creek, which is the site of the first Indian massacre in Utah Territory. So when there were reports around the winter of 47 and early 48 of stolen horses, stolen cattle, Captain John Scott up in Salt Lake immediately decides to gather troops and mount an expedition. Around this time, Brigham Young tells Scott 4 times, "We've found the horses. My herd is grazing to the east of Lake Utah, and we've simply moved them to a private stables elsewhere. We've found them. Why are you going down there?" But Scott either ignores them or pretends not to hear them. We know that he got them, and he gathers his 44 men and continues south to about 10 miles just down the hill from where this battle happened. And he meets with Little Chief, which is kind of a leader of the local Timpanogos people, but he wakes up before sunrise, and he sees 45 armed men and horses surrounding his camp and interspersed amongst the teepees. He knows if he says anything to offend Captain John Scott, he and all of his people might be massacred. So Scott says, "Y'all have been stealing cattle and horses. Where are the culprits?" And Little Chief says, "Listen, I'll give you my own son, and the people responsible are 2 men by the name of Cone and Blue Shirt, and they're about 10 miles up the mountainside in what's now called Battle Creek." He said, "Please, there's 70 people there, they're mostly families. Go in calmly, show what you have, do a show of force, and then just arrest them. There's no need for bloodshed." But Captain John Scott already had bloodshed in his heart. That's exactly what he wanted. So he comes up here being guided by Little Chief's son, and he breaks his unit into 4 separate groups, surrounding them on both sides. And by this point in time, it's still early morning. Nobody's really woken up yet, but there's a woman that's walked out of her tent to fetch water, and she's able to sense there is an odd quiet around the camp before the animals start to pick up, the dogs and the chickens, and they realize that something must be happening. So immediately Cone walks out of his tent, and John Scott calls down and says, "Surrender, we've got you surrounded." And Cone says, "What are you doing?" Well, they shoot him in the back of the neck, and it blows the top of his head off, and all hell breaks loose, because as soon as one shot is taken, everybody else begins shooting down. They killed probably between 7 and 10 people, and 17 people, it's estimated, went to just scurry up the hills. And finally, a 16-year-old girl bravely approached the captain himself and said, "Why are you doing this?" And Captain Scott went and got a settler by the name of Dimmick Huntington, who grabbed the little girl and said, "Go get your brother. Where's your brother?" And this little boy, he walks up and he says, "You killed my brother. You killed my father. Why are you here? Leave us be." And they said, "Where's the gun in your camp?" So he goes and gets the gun after they threaten to open his eyes and open his ears, holding a gun to his head. Dimmick Huntington is threatening the 16-year-old boy. He goes and gets the gun and he throws it on the ground hard enough to break it, basically as a screw you. And at this point in time, a neighboring village, which is run by Chief Opakari, who's also of the Timpanogos, they hear the shots. And Opakari gets up on the hill right over here, and he's looking down at the bloodshed and the carnage taking place, and it's about that time that Blue Shirt, who's been hiding in the sage for a while trying to make his move, he tries to climb up the hill and make a mad dash to Opakari, but he's shot 16 times, and they just continue shooting. So this battle, which has gone on for about 2 hours, it comes to a stop, and there are bodies all along the floor here. And Captain John Scott orders his troops to pick up rocks and start throwing them at the bodies to see who's alive and who's dead. They start guiding them down the valley. They're prisoners. And Little Chief comes up and he is in tears. He says, "Why would you do this? We trusted you. It would have been so easy to walk down in there." And Captain John Scott justifies it by the find they had made of 10 hides. That's it. And well, the boy that came, the 16-year-old boy that threw the gun at John Scott's feet, he would later come to be known as Chief Blackhawk, and he would wage the most brutal war amongst the Indians that the settlers in Utah had ever seen. Next to me now is the grave of Chief Antonga Blackhawk, who was the hidden weapon that waged a years-long war, the Blackhawk War, against the settlers. The Timpanogos are losing 80-90% of their tribe, and the tribe is quickly fracturing. And this is a far cry from what it was in 1776 when they controlled literally all of the Great Basin. And Aropine is in 1865 down in the settlement of Manti, and he's trying to reach an agreement with the settlers, and he's on his horseback when a man named John Lowry, he's a drunken settler, he comes up and he grabs Chief Aropine and he pulls him from his horse, and Aropine is in the dirt, and he dusts himself off as all these settlers are laughing at him, and he rides his horse up into the hills. This is the last straw.
John Lowry was, in his day and age, respected as an interpreter and a peacemaker, and he would actually go out of his way to try to make peace with the Native Americans, establishing missions among them. But apparently, when Chief Arpine rode in, John Lowry was a bit drunk, and he pulled him off his horse, and this is the act which started the Blackhawk War. Now, Lowry himself died only in 1915, after first being hit by a train, and then being hit by a car, dying of his injuries a few months later.
And he enlists the services of his relative, Chief Antongo Blackhawk. When he sees the chief of his beleaguered and dying tribe pulled from his horse, he sees this as a last straw. And by the end of that day, he had stolen 30 horses and killed 5 white settlers. And this war would last for several years. Brigham Young realized at that point he had screwed up. So one of the mountain men, who was later in the hills, he would come down and talk to the Mormon leadership, was Elijah Barney Ward. And he's actually mentioned in Wild Bill Hickman's book as a very fascinating person. And once he befriended Hickman and converted to Mormonism, the rest of the mountain men kind of joined in their fight against the Indians. So, because he had built up that reputation for himself, they saw him as somebody who had turned their backs on the Native Americans. He was the first death in the Blackhawk War years later.
And you can see here the grave of William Shepard Baxter right next to the grave of the mountain man Elijah Ward, who was the first person killed, right alongside his friend James Anderson as the war kicked off. And you can tell that these were some targeted killings. They were very personal to Chief Blackhawk, and he wanted these men dead.
Behind me now is the Diamond Battlefield, and this is a very overlooked but very crucial part of the early Blackhawk War, and it featured the outlaw Ike Potter. Basically, the story goes that by mid-1866, early on in this war, the only people that were really fighting were a couple of wild-headed youth who went along with Chief Blackhawk. Most of the reservation youths rallied under Chief Tabi, who kind of kept them in order and said, you know, the Mormons aren't our enemies. Well, around this time, the Mormon leadership said that we're going to gather up 350 Nauvoo Legion and use them to patrol the trails. Well, the trails they were patrolling were going to be on the reservation, so Chief Tabi got really upset. And we don't really know if Chief Tabi was behind this battle, but anyway, several men assemble and lead their war parties. These include Ike Potter, Ike's friend Richard, and Mountain, who is the brother of Chief Blackhawk, naturally leading a band of warriors. They descend into the Utah Valley and begin killing. They run off cattle, they cause a lot of havoc, and then they come back up here as they encounter a larger force of the Nauvoo Legion. They pin the Nauvoo Legion down for a while, but after a full day battle, somebody arrives, officer named Snow, and kind of runs them off up Spanish Fork.
And would you look at that, these cows drove me off. But you know, I suppose it's their property.
And after that initial skirmish ended, basically all of the Utes scattered, except they went underneath different bands. And the ones who followed Chief Mountain, who was the brother of Chief Blackhawk, they went up Spanish Fork in an effort to find somebody who was basically in a blood feud with their chief. A couple years prior, this man had accused Blackhawk of stealing something on his farm and had beaten him with a bucket. Now, of course, that bodes very poorly for the man once Blackhawk declares war on the settlers, and his brother comes down, and with his band of braves, they kill him and scatter his cattle and his horses. Well, the Nauvoo Legion is already on high alert, and when they see all these horses running, they go and find the murder scene, and they chase the troops basically up, or the braves up this canyon. And again, because it is a camp of warriors, they are pinned down, and 8 Nauvoo Legion men come charging up into the Utes. Even though they're pinned down and arrows are raining down on them, they charge up into the Ute camp, and 3 of them are immediately killed in a hail of gunfire and arrows. And after this, they kind of sit around and they wait for a while, and under covering fire, basically the Utes silently slip away up the canyons and into the forest, and Chief Tabi, whether or not he was involved with this fight, he realized that it would not be a war they could win, and a couple of people stayed under Chief Blackhawk, and they viewed their losses as something that would incite them to more revolts, but Tabi was kind of a practical guy, and eventually, over the reservation Utes, they called them, he warned Brigham Young, I can't control these guys anymore, because you keep killing them. After this point in time, there was a building of forts that happened all over Utah, and Brigham Young decided to tell his flock, you better group all your cows together, bring them up to Salt Lake under military guard, and you got to go into the forts if you ever detect any trouble. And an interesting note in all of this is that after the battle, the man who was leading the Nauvoo Legion and many other people involved all signed affidavits saying white men were leading the Indians. Whereas they said earlier that the battle down the canyon, that was led by Chief Tabi, they said this one was led by white men. Now I think this is because at this battle you had Isaac Potter, who was kind of in a blood feud with Aaron Johnson, a local Mormon bishop. He decided to befriend the Indians, and he worked up a very good relationship with them. But of course, the Mormons at the time, they feared federal government encroachment, and they believed, as pointed out by their affidavits, that maybe Indian officials were trying to incite the Indians to kill the Mormons. Behind me now is Fort Deseret, which is probably the most well-preserved fort of the Blackhawk War. And as the story goes, the army here in Utah was kind of put in an unusual position. The Civil War just started, most of them had to go back to Texas or to the South to fight in the Civil War, and you had a couple of federal officials here in the territory, and they said, you gotta fort up, make your own forts, and kind of reactivate your local militias, and that's what the town of Deseret did, and the town nowadays is about 2 miles to the north of here. And they erected this fort in 1865, and by 1866 you had Blackhawk, which actually conducted a raid on the town just north, and because they had some advance notice, they all went to the fort and they were able to negotiate a couple of cattle so that Blackhawk would simply just go away. So this fort was a very nice success in the grand scheme of the war, and it has been left standing out here in Millard County ever since. Next to me now is the grave of Lewis Lund, a sad death in the Blackhawk War, and he's buried in the Fountain Green City Cemetery because Fountain Green was a very opportunistic target for the Indian raiders. Basically, it was surrounded on all sides by mountains, and it was cut off by a mountain pass. So a lot of people stayed here, figuring if we try to head out the mountain pass to Nephi and up to Salt Lake, we might be ambushed. So they stayed here. And in the early days of the Indian War, they would guard their herds with a number of people posted around. Now, normally there would be 6 people with rifles, and these would normally be teenagers, while the adults were out in the hills fighting. And Lewis Lund arrived to work finding only a couple of other people that day, and he figured, you know, it's kind of a slow day, I'm gonna go hunting. So he shoots a rabbit just near the herd, and him and his friend go off to clean the rabbit near the local stream, just out of sight of the rest of the people who were watching the herd, when a group of Indians comes down with their rifles firing, and they hit him over the back of the head and shoot him. And his friend also goes down, but he plays dead, and then the Native Americans ride off and scatter the herd. But Lewis Lund, who was only 17 years old at the time, he passed away, and his story was retold in the early 2000s. So in 2008, relatives in the Historical Society gave him a new grave here in Fountain Green. Buried in the cemetery in Manti are dozens of men who were with the Utah Territorial Militia at the time of the Blackhawk War. A lot of these guys would have also been in the Nauvoo Legion or the Deseret Militia or the Mormon Battalion, and we've got a couple of graves of those in the cemetery as well. There are about 150 engagements of the Blackhawk War, and then a lot of these would stretch back to Chief Walcaro's War, which was fought not too far away from here. So most of these men would have seen some form of action in these dozens and dozens of engagements, although relatively few were actually killed. But there are a few graves of massacre victims in this cemetery as well. Well, as Blackhawk's war is taking off, Sanpitch thinks that he can make peace, so he gets on his horseback and in good faith rides into the town of Manti and says, I would like to negotiate terms of peace. I mean, if you negotiate with me, I will be able to bring my brother out or my son out from hiding in the hills, and he will most likely reach a peaceful conclusion. Well, they say, well, you're in town already, and we got a jail right over there. We're just going to throw you in there, and once your son finds out about this, Antongo will ride right on down and negotiate. And it's at that moment that Sanpitch realizes that he has made a grave mistake. They take his offer of peace and they throw it in jail with him. And a while later, there's a jailbreak, 1866, and Sanpitch, he's on the run, and he's shot, most likely in the leg and in the arm, and he's pretty gravely wounded, but he makes it up to the canyon behind me, and now he's being pursued by a posse of people from the town. And it seems that 2 settlers shot him.
Chief Sanpitch is buried here just south of the town of Fountain Green. This is on private property, so I'm not going to go over the fence here, but after he was killed in Manti Canyon, his band found his remains and they brought him to a large rock near where he would have made camp with his followers and his people, and it is just beyond these trees here that this rock is. That's it right there. And for a few years afterwards, maybe his people made camp here, but eventually, very soon later, they were confined to the Uinta and Ore Reservation. At the back of the Heber City Cemetery, marked by a simple sandstone marker and the letters TT, is Tom Tabi, the son of Chief Tabi Tokwana. And Brigham Young recognized Tabi Tokwana, a name which means child of the sun, as a member of the royal dynasty, descended from the head chief, Turunchichi, who was contacted by the Spaniards when they arrived here in the Dominguez Escalante expedition. When Tabi Tokwana tried to make peace in 1850, he rode down to Fort Utah, it was February at the time, and the lake was frozen. They start seeing headless bodies out on the frozen lake, and they start freaking out. They drive up to the fort to ask them what happened, and they learn of the Fort Utah massacre. Basically, the Mormon settlers were growing fearful that the Timpanogos tribe was going to cut off their supply routes to the Mormon colonies to the south of Utah, and they invited them into the fort at a time of unease when people were starving over the rough winter, and they said, we'll give you some cattle and we'll settle things. Well, instead they locked their wives and children in a cage and then executed all the men that they could, and the ones who ran, they executed on the lake. They chased them down on horses. Altogether, about 102 people were executed, and Tabi Tokwana, the child of the sun, he has the courage to ride directly up to the fort and say, what in the hell are you doing? And when these tribes go on the warpath, Tabi Tokwana always had that urge to, pursue peace, even though he'd seen so much wrong. Well, in 1867, Tabi Tokwana rides down from the mountains in Heber City. And it's interesting, just the geography of Heber City. It's surrounded on all sides by these mountain ranges and separated from Salt Lake City. So you can imagine the fear in the settlers as the head chief of the Timpanogos rides down into the valley, but they see that he's carrying somebody in his arms. And that somebody is his son, Tom Tabi, who died in a hunting accident. And so when he rides up here, he talks to the settlers. I believe it might have been the man who's buried next to him. And he says, my son died and I wanted to extend the olive branch of peace. He said, I would like him to be buried in the Mormon style. And so he was buried in the family plot here. And after he was buried in the Mormon style and they said their prayers, he said, now I would like him to be buried in the style of my people. So they lit a huge funeral pile for Tom Tabi. And it's interesting also because all in this family plot, on the opposite side you have other graves that are marked Utah Territorial Militia, and these are veterans from the Indian Wars. I don't know if these men died. I don't believe they died in the Indian Wars because they ended in 1872, and these graves show 75. But you can see all along here he was a captain in the Territorial Militia. And there are other members of the Indian Wars over here. And it was this olive branch extended by Tabi Tokwana that more or less kind of brought an easing of tensions that would end the Blackhawk War in 1872.
The raiding continues for a few more years until 72 or around there, and then even after that there's a few minor isolated incidents of Indian violence.
Here in the little Freedom Pioneer Cemetery you have the grave of James O'Nutt, and the locals called him Indian Jim. There's not too much info about him online, but he's a fascinating character. The town of Freedom was founded in 1870 towards the later years of the Blackhawk War, and it's just on the outskirts of Nephi. Around the start of this war, people had begun settling in this valley right here ahead of me. And when the war began, they had to kind of form little isolated settlements and fortify. Well, one of these was Freedom in 1870, and Indian Jim was one of those people that kind of grew up or might have even been sold to a white family when he was a child, and he was a scout. He would help the settlement by letting them know whenever Blackhawks raiders were near, and the settlement pretty much escaped harm, and the locals in town loved him. They made a little dugout on the outskirts that he lived in with his wife, and he had a horse and buggy, and he always dressed nicely whenever he visited the town of Nephi, and he died in 1928 and was given a proper burial here with the rest of the pioneers. On April 5th, 1868, Chief Blackhawk received his mortal wound here at Rocky Ford in the field behind me. Basically, 23 settlers were moving south to the vicinity of Monroe, where they wanted to settle, and Blackhawk comes down from the hills, sweeping 30 Indians across the plain. 2 of the 23 white settlers are killed, and Blackhawk is shot as he's trying to rescue one of the Native Americans in his band, who fell. He was shot in the hip. Blackhawk was trying to rescue him, and Blackhawk himself was shot. Now, it took a couple of years for him to die of his wound, but he realized that now is the time for him to make peace, because he feared if he didn't, then the war would go on for many more years, and he succeeded in his mission of peace. This town is now called Seagard, and in fact the Rocky Ford name is kind of forgotten to history. The settlers after the battle started taking to calling it Cedar Ridge, but you still have Rocky Ford here, and the actual monument to it is located right behind the Seagard Town Hall. The battle would have taken place right over here in the hills in this basin. Something which makes the Indian Wars in Utah so unique to the Wild West is the participation of people who were not necessarily in the military. So while the town of Manti is only 5 miles south of us, in Ephraim there is a man by the name of Knut Peterson who lived in this house about a quarter mile down the road. And where I'm standing now would have been Fort Ephraim, and they would have all come here during Indian raids. Well, Knut Peterson was a friend of the Native Americans, and when he heard that Chief Blackhawk had been mortally wounded in an attempt to rescue a fallen comrade at the Battle of Gravelly Ford, he basically started appealing to the Native Americans just as an interested party. People were very terrified, and 2 counties had been partially evacuated, over 20 settlements had been cleared of people, and they all went back to Salt Lake or fortified in forts like the one in front of me. But there was a local man named Knut Peterson who was an immigrant from overseas, and he decided to form good relations with the Native Americans. He learned their tongue, and he invited them to his house for a feast. 10 chiefs showed up, and they realized he was a good man, so they met just across the road, and they just walked over to the park here and met underneath this tree. Chief Blackhawk showed up, and he quelled his his rebellious braves, and they all smoked a peace pipe, and the term of the agreement was, so long as the water flowed in the creek to the left, the war would be over. And eventually this treaty was ratified by the president, and over the next few months the raids began to stop, punctuated only by the occasional band of outlaws. The war itself was over, and the war up until that point had killed about 70 people, and in part Blackhawk wanted to make peace because he had just been gravely wounded, something he would die of a few years later at the Battle of Gravelly Ford. They were stealing cattle, and they shot one of his friends, and as he went back to go try to rescue his buddy, Blackhawk himself was shot, and he would later die of blood poisoning from this.